The OBS says that the fan is not getting picked up by the microphone, so I'm gonna leave this thing. I have a fan on back here. It's getting kind of hot. So, let's leave that for now. Let's get the link. Hmm. Okay, I think that's everything. Just put that away. Get notes here. Trying not to burp on stream too much while I drink all this water. Because I feel a little dry, so. Anyway, hello and welcome to the stream. Parson reads the Book of Samuel. And today, we are going to do the second part of the Absalom Arc, as I like to call it. As these, I guess technically it's like 7 chapters, but they're like, I'm reading 8 chapters between the 2 weeks, but 7 chapters that really are about one of David's sons, Absalom. Now, I will be reading from the New International Version. I'll give my preface after we start our stream with a quick prayer. But if you want to follow along, I'll be reading from the New International Version starting on chapter 16 of 2 Samuel. So let's just bow our heads quickly for a moment and then we will begin. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. And we thank you for this time that we have to read your word, and just pray that as we read your word, we would understand that it is ultimately you that we are to put our trust in. Because we know that what if we trust anyone or anything else, our lives would crumble pretty quickly. But we know that it is in you, our rock and our foundation. And I just pray that as we read your word, we would be reminded of that. I pray this in the name of your son, Jesus. Amen. Okay, so. Last time, which was a while ago, as I did miss last week, 2 weeks ago we read the first part of the Absalom Arc, as I like to call it, and basically this story arc in the book of 2 Samuel is about one of David's sons. Sorry, scam caller just calling my phone. You can tell it's a scam caller because it's like, you know, some number you've never seen before from like Indonesia. So, anyway. And David's son Absalom is a very interesting character. I think he's probably the most interesting character to study. Because my hot take when we started talking about him was that if you actually read Absalom's story, he's the perfect reflection of our culture. And especially my generation, right? That's my generation. In that, like, you know, a millennial kind of, you know, a millennial, right? And even a Gen Zer. Well, he's not, Absalom would not be so much of a Gen Zer. He's not that young, right? But definitely the attitudes that millennials have towards like the older generation. Absalom is a good reflection of that, and a lot of people of my age group would feel the way he does. But of course, you know, this is something that's like both interesting to study in the sense of like you can learn a lot about people by studying Absalom, and of course the other thing on the flip side, you know, to watch the dangers that my generation's walking into, right? Or has already walked into in a lot of ways. And I know that's a bit of a hot take because, of course, you know, we'll kind of find out in this half of the story, Absalom isn't the greatest guy, right? Because the first half of the story, he actually, and this is where, like, I think he's such a great character to study, is that the story kind of paints both sides of, paints both a good and bad side to him. And you have to take the good and the bad with it, right? And when you find yourself relating to someone like Absalom, right, you gotta take the good and the bad and be honest about it, right? But at the same time, with that said, that really allows you as an individual to really be more introspective about yourself, right, and to be honest about that introspection. And I think that's another reason why he's such a great character to study. So I'll just kind of do a quick overview of his, the first half of the story. So we're first introduced to him because his sister Tamar was a rape victim, and none other than their, I guess you could say their half brother, Amon or Amnon. Sorry, sorry, I was thinking StarCraft. StarCraft 2 kind of came to mind there. Not Amon, Amnon. And Amnon, you know, he total scumbag of a human being, right? And you know, he has his way with Tamar, and of course, Tamar goes to her brother Absalom, and you know, Absalom's introduced to the story, and he's introduced as a pretty good guy, right? He does what anyone would do in his case, right? You know, he cares for the vulnerable, he cares for the those who have been victimized, right? He he shows compassion and all that, right? And that, you know, that's definitely something we like. Yeah, of course, right? I too would show compassion to, you know, someone important to me that was, you know, raped, right? But then, of course, as the story progresses, and this is where I kind of use the whole like millennial versus the baby boomer generation kind of thing, Absalom feels like his dad does nothing, right? The older generation does nothing, and you know that's kind of true, right? When Amnon had his way with Tamar, you know, David doesn't do anything, right? We don't see that David does anything, and that can easily make Amnon pretty bitter toward his dad. Similar to how, you know, millennials do kind of feel bitter toward the older generation for a lot of reasons, right? And, you know, I don't want to get too much into that, but as most of it is kind of self-explanatory. But that bitterness leads to Absalom wanting to take over his father's throne, right? And this is where, you know, he goes over that really danger, you know, walking on eggshells kind of thing. And there's that passage where I think it's chapter. I think it starts. It's like in early chapter 15, and in chapter 15, Absalom says. Let me just find the exact passage. Chapter 15, verse 4. And in chapter 15, verse 4, Absalom talks about how, where's the king for you, the people, when you need your help, right? Where's the king? Why isn't he helping you? Here I am helping you, hearing your cases, being a judge for you when you need it. If only I were king, right? Things would be better. And so Absalom, with that, he riles the people up so that they would support him when he claims to be the king of Israel. This, of course, the word of this gets to the palace when Absalom declares himself king, and then David has to run away. And now basically, the throne is being occupied by Absalom. And then David's kind of like, oh no, what do I do, right? And that's kind of how chapter 15 ends. But the thing to be mindful of is that, as I've said multiple times in this Bible reading session with the book of Samuel, only God can be king, right? And the reasoning for that is that human beings, power corrupts them, right? That's just a known fact, right? And that's why we have that old saying, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So that had happened to Saul, it had happened to David, and now it's happening to Absalom. So that's where we left off with chapter 15. Now, we move on to chapter 16, and I want to just give a quick preface of this. I know it's a long, review, but since I wasn't here last week, I felt like the need to go over the review was important. Even though, yes, technically you could just go watch, the last stream, but I figure I still talk about it anyway. So that leads to the question: where do we go from here, right? What is David going to do? As the story goes back to focusing on David, right? Because the last few chapters were all about Absalom and his rise to power and usurping his father. Right? And so what does David do from here? Well, he's got to get some allies. He's got to organize himself, right? He's got to figure out how Absalom was able to sway the hearts of the people, and so on. All right, chapter 16, and this is where we begin. Now when David had gone a short distance between the summit, there was Ziba, the steward of Mephibosheth. Yes, hard to pronounce names are back. Waiting to meet him, he had a string of donkeys saddled and loaded with 200 loaves of bread, 100 cakes of raisins, 100 cakes of figs, and a skin of wine. And the king of Ziba asked, "Why have you brought these?" Ziba answered, "The donkeys are the king's household to ride on. The bread and the fruit are for the men to eat. And the wine is to refresh those who have become exhausted in the wilderness." And the king then asked, "Where is your master's grandson?" Ziba said to him, "He is staying in Jerusalem because he thinks today the Israelites will restore to me my grandfather's kingdom." Then the king of Ziba said, I totally did all those voices wrong. Then the king said to Ziba, "All that has belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours." "I humbly bow," Ziba said. "May I find favor in your eyes, my lord the king." Now as King David approached Bahurim, a man from the same clan as Saul's family came out from there, and his name was Shimei, son of Gera, and he cursed as he came out. And he pelted David and all the king's officials with stones. Through all the troops and the special guard were on David's right and left. As he cursed, Shimei said, "Get out! Get out, you murderer! Get out, you scoundrel! The Lord has repaid you for all the blood you shed in the household of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. The Lord has given the kingdom into the hands of your son Absalom. You have come to ruin because you are a murderer." Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said to the king, "Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and cut off his head." But David said, "What does this have to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord said to him, 'Curse David,' who can ask, 'Why do you do this?'" So then David said to Abishai and all his officials, "My son, my own flesh and blood is trying to kill me. How much more than this Benjamite? Leave this guy alone. Let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be that the Lord will look upon my misery and restore to me his covenant blessing instead of his curse today." So David and his men continued along the road, while Shimei was going along the hillside opposite him, cursing as he went and throwing stones at him and showering him with dirt. The king and all his people with him arrived at their destination, exhausted, and there David refreshed himself. Verse 15. Meanwhile, Absalom and all the men of Israel came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel was with him. Then Hushai the Archite, David's confidant, went to Absalom and said to him, "Long live the king! Long live the king!" Absalom said to Hushai, "So this is the love you show your friend? If he's your friend, why didn't you go with him?" Hushai said to Absalom, "No, the one chosen by the Lord, by these people, and by all the men of Israel. His I will be, and I will remain with him. Furthermore, whom should I serve? Should I not serve the son, just as I served your father? So I will serve you well." Now Absalom said to Ahithophel, "Give us your advice. What should we do?" Now Ahithophel answered, "Sleep with your father's concubines, whom he left to take care of the palace. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself obnoxious with your father, and the hands of everyone with you will be more resolute." So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and he slept with his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Now in those days the advice Ahithophel gave was like that of the one who inquires of God. That was how both David and Absalom regarded all of Ahithophel's advice. So, chapter 16. Chapter 16 is pretty neat because it kind of splits the perspective of the story, right? So first we have, David and his runaways, I guess you could say. And they're kind of running around in the wilderness and away from Absalom and Jerusalem. And they're met by this guy, Shimei, right? Well, I guess I should talk about the Ziba thing first. Ziba's thing is not that important, right? Ziba's just, a guy who's helping him out. A guy showing kindness. Which, is one of those things that, like, how do I put this? David really needs the help of guys like Ziba right now, right? And so, for Ziba to show up and him to be kind to him, giving him, food and wine and everything, and to take care of him, that's something that David really needs in his time of trouble. But this is quickly contrasted with Shumei, or Shumai. Maybe it's Shumei. And Shumei, who's like one of the sons of Saul from his many wives or whatever, right? His many concubines or something. Shumei has nothing good to say about David, right? He's just like talking mad crap with him and, calling him a murderer and accusing him of all his crimes and everything, right? And the interesting thing in that the Bible tells us that David just takes it, right? He just takes this, right? Where Shumei is just calling him like the worst of names. And of course, the Bible here just kind of tones it down a bit, where he just calls him like a murderer and a scoundrel. But you can be sure that he called him a bunch of other nasty things, right? And one of David's servants just like, yo, man, like, who is this guy? Let's just kill him, right? He's one guy, right? But it's interesting that David just takes it, right? He's just like, like, just leave him alone. Who are we to stop him from saying what he wants to say, right? And to say what's on his mind. And something that comes to mind, something I think about as I read this passage, David is viewing everything that's happening in a very realistic way, in the sense of like, you reap what you sow, right? And while Nathan, the prophet Nathan, a few chapters back did say like, David, like, God will forgive you if you repent and all that, right? But David still feels guilt of many things, I'm sure, right? Obviously, the Bathsheba thing comes to mind, right? And the murder of Uriah probably quickly comes to mind. But I'm sure there are other things too, right? And I think that's why the wording is so poignant here, where Shumei calls David a murderer and a scoundrel, because that's definitely what he was then, right? Because maybe Shumei's talking about something else entirely, right? He's talking about like all the wrongs he did against Saul, right? And what he stole from Saul, and that could be part of it too. And then of course there's all the stuff in all the underlining stuff that that you kind of see in between the lines that David is also guilty of, right? His inaction toward Amnon, his failure as a father toward Absalom, right? And all these things. And David is probably thinking like, you know what? I had this coming, right? And what Shumei says is true, right? I am garbage. I am filth, etc., etc. I deserve to be cursed at. And that's probably what David is thinking. And, I mean, he'd be rightfully thinking that, right? Because of all the stuff that he allowed to happen. And that's a very interesting, thing for David to just kind of just take this abuse. And it's one of those things that I think about where, like, you see a lot of, like, flack and, like, I don't know how to word this, because we're entering hot take territory here. But, that's kind of, like, what you see a lot on, like, the internet now, where people just badmouth the past, right? The older generation and our predecessors. And, a lot of younger people are just bad-mouthing. And that can easily be seen with, like, David and Shumei, right? Shumei is this younger person. And he's just talking mad crap toward, someone much older than him, as opposed to, showing elders respect. right? No, Shumei's having none of that. He's just gonna continuously curse, right? But David is very sympathetic, and he's also very humble about it, right? He's just kind of like, you know what he says, what Shumei says is true. I have done a lot of awful things, and so he just kind of just takes it. And yes, while it's true, we can say that the past generations have done a lot of wrong things, and they will probably just take it because what's the older generation gonna do, right? They can't deny that they've done a lot of things wrong, but the real question is, well, what do you do about it then, right? And that's the other thing about Shumei that's interesting to think about too. He's all talk, right? He just spews out words. He doesn't raise his hand against David or anything. He's all bark and no bite. Now the funny thing is we contrasted Shumei with Ziba, who's Ziba being a nice guy, and then Shumei being kind of like a demagogue. But then we get to Absalom, back to Absalom, and he is, unlike Shumei, who's just talk. Absalom is action, right? I'm like, the way I worded that. But anyway, now Absalom, he's just like, I'm the king now, right? And what should I do to piss off my dad even more? And I love how at the end of chapter 16, the Bible mentions that like David and Absalom kind of really highly value Ahithophel's advice. Like he shows he's so smart and so wise a counselor that like he is equated to like the voice of God kind of thing, which is kind of an extreme comparison, but I mean that's basically what that bit means at the end of chapter 16, where it says that in those days the advice Ahithophel gave was like the one who inquires of God. That is how both David and Absalom regarded all of his advice. It's basically the idea that like he's equated to like the words of God at times, right? That he's that his advice is that good, which is hilarious that the Bible points this out because the advice he gives Absalom is gotta be some of the worst advice you could possibly give someone, right? He's like, yeah, why don't you just make yourself make a declaration that you hate your father, right? That you hate everything of the past by screwing your dad's concubines. How is that possibly good advice, right? I mean, sure, there's the whole idea that's conveyed here that that Ahithophel tells Absalom, where it's like, then people will know that you're serious about like destroying your dad's kingdom, right? Because you yourself are going to defile it by publicly screwing, his concubines. And this is the thing about Absalom that really draws out like this is the kind of person he is, right? And hot take time. You guys ready for this, right? Like, I think of like the male feminist person. These guys that like I protect women, but at the same time, you find on the internet that a lot of male feminists are often wildly accused of tons of sexual assault and things like that, and being kind of major dickbags to women, despite the fact that they protect women. And Absalom is kind of I think of like the male feminist when I think of like Absalom here, right? At first Absalom seemed like such a great guy, right? He protects women, right? He avenges his sister and all of that, right? Isn't he such a great? He even seems like a champion for his sister and for women in that regard. When he names his daughter after his sister, right? Oh, he's such a great, like, you first read that, you think, oh, Absalom's such a great guy, he really cares about those who are victimized. And then here he is, just like being a scumbag
and just like, you know, does the whole harem thing and just takes advantage of all these women, right? I mean, he's the king. The women aren't going to say no, right? Otherwise, you die, right? Because that's kind of why monarchies are generally bad, right? So, like, he just, like, Absalom just goes to mega. He goes from 0 to 100. Well, I mean, I guess he was already a major scumbag when he decided to overthrow his father in the most uncouth way. But here he is now, just like, well, we're going to have outdoor sex and people are going to watch me, you know, have sex with all the concubines, right? Real stand-up guy this guy is, right? Like, now we can kind of see him as a total scumbag because he's doing this, right? And how is this? I don't know why. I don't know how this is possibly good advice from Ahithophel, right? I mean, I know the Bible says that, like, okay, Ahithophel, the suggestion he gave to Absalom was that, like, if people see that you're serious about how much you hate your dad, then the rest of Israel will be like, yeah, let's rally behind Absalom and hate on David too, right? Maybe that's the idea. But seriously, the advice on a practical level is kind of terrible, which makes me question that last part of chapter 16, right? How would anyone have thought that the advice of Ahithophel was like the words of God, right? When you have advice like this, it's just like absolutely terrible. But I guess hindsight is 2020, right? Of course, before we move on to chapter 17, we do have to bring up what's this guy's name? Hushai. If you don't remember who Hushai is, or who he was, Hushai showed up in chapter 15. And so just the last chapter, but to be fair, that was like 2 weeks ago, right? So Hushai was basically a guy that David sent back to Jerusalem to sabotage, that's the word I was thinking of, to sabotage Absalom, right? To get behind enemy lines, figure out, you know, learn what Absalom was plotting, and to also kind of obstruct him by giving him like bad advice kind of thing, right? So he was kind of there to sabotage Absalom. And so we get to see him kind of pledge his service, but you know he's kind of, you know, got his fingers double crossed with the fingers behind his back thing, right? As he makes his oath to like serve Absalom, because of course Hushai is someone we saw in chapter 15 to be loyal to David. All right, that's chapter 16. Let's move on to chapter 17. Now the fan is like blowing the pages here. So Ahithophel said to Absalom, I would choose 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David. I would attack him while he was weary and weak. I would strike him with terror, and then all the people with him will flee. I would strike down only the king and bring all the people back to you. The death of all the men you seek will mean the return of all. All the people will be unharmed. This plan seemed good to Absalom and to the elders of Israel. But Absalom said, summon also Hushai the Archite, so we can hear what he has to say as well. When Hushai came to him, Absalom said, Ahithophel has given this advice. Should we do what he says? If not, give us your opinion. Hushai replied to Absalom, the advice Ahithophel has given is not good this time. You know your father and his men. They are fighters, and are as fierce as a wild bear robbed of her cubs. Besides, your father is an experienced fighter. He will not spend the night with the troops. Even now, he is hidden in a cave or some other place. If he should attack your troops first, whoever hears about it will say, there has been a slaughter among the troops who follow Absalom. Then even the bravest soldier, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will melt with fear. For all Israel knows that your father is a fighter, and that those with him are brave. So I advise you, let all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, as numerous as the sands on the seashore, be gathered to you, with you yourself leading them into battle. Then we will attack him wherever he may be found, and we will fall on him as dew settles on the ground. Neither he nor any of his men will be left alive. If he withdraws into a city, then all Israel will bring ropes to that city, and we will drag it down to the valley, until not so much as a pebble is left. Absalom and all the men of Israel said, The advice of Hushai of the Archite is better than that of Ahithophel. For the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. Now Hushai told Zadok and Abiathar, the priest, Ahithophel has advised Absalom and the elders of Israel to do such and such, but I have advised them to do so and so. Now send a message at once and tell David, do not spend the night at the fords in the wilderness. Cross over without fail, or the king and all the people with him will be swallowed up. Jonathan and Amahaz, were staying at En-Rogel. A female servant was to go and inform them, and they were to go tell the king, for they could not risk being seen entering the city. But a young man saw them and told Absalom. So the two of them left at once and went to the house of a man in Bahurim. He had a well in his courtyard, and they climbed down into it. His wife took a covering and spread it over the opening of the well and scattered grain over it. No one knew anything about it. When Absalom's men came to the women at the house, they asked, Where are Amahaz and Jonathan? And the woman answered, They crossed over the brook. The men searched but found no one, so they returned to Jerusalem. Now after they had gone, the two climbed out of the well and went to inform King David. And they said to him, Set out across... Sorry, I need voices for these guys. Set out and cross the river at once. Ahithophel has advised such and such against you. So David and all the people with him set out and crossed the Jordan. By daybreak no one was left who had not crossed the Jordan. When Ahithophel saw that his advice had not been followed, he saddled his donkey and set out for his house in his hometown. He put his house in order and then hanged himself. So he died and was buried in his father's tomb. Now David went to Mahanaim, and Absalom crossed the Jordan with all the men of Israel. Absalom had appointed Amasa over the army in place of Joab. Amasa was the son of Jether, or Yether. I'm going to say Jether, an Ishmaelite, who had married Abigail, the daughter of Nahash and sister of Zeruiah, the mother of Joab. So a different Abigail, not one of David's many wives, Abigail. But to be fair, if anyone were reading this, they would be confused too. Verse 26, the Israelites and Absalom camped in the land of Gilead. Now when David came to Mahanaim, Shobi, son of Nahash, and Rabbah of the Ammonites, and Machir, son of Amiel from Lodabar, and Barzillai, the Gileadite from Rogelim, brought beddings and bowls and articles of pottery. They also brought wheat and barley, flour and roasted grain, beans and lentils, honey and curds, sheep and cheese from cows, for David and his people to eat. For they said, the people have come, exhausted and hungry, and thirsty, in the wilderness. Alright, so that's chapter 17. Boy, there's a lot in this chapter, so we're gonna go dig through this, right? So the story begins with Ahithophel and Absalom, right? And Absalom's thinking like, all right, I just banged all my dad's concubines, and now we've riled up the people and made a public declaration against my dad. So, what do we do now, right? How are we gonna actually strike down, King David, right? And Ahithophel actually comes up with good advice here for a change, right? Unlike the whole screwing the concubines, which was pretty bad advice. Here he actually gives really good advice, right? He's like, well, why don't we just send a small task force, right? Let's send a small task force and just ninja his ass, right? Like that's basically Ahithophel's plan. And to be fair, it's a pretty good plan, right? And he gives all the good reasoning for it, right? He's like, well, it would look, it's only your dad we want, right? So, and it's only him that we've made an enemy of Israel, right? If we kill everybody else, that will make us look bad. So let's just send a small task force, kill David, and be done with it, right? Sounds like a good plan, right? So I guess, the end of chapter 16 is kind of true. Ahithophel has advice that's really good, and some people might think that it's godly advice. When he gives advice like this, I guess that's true enough, right? So that's Ahithophel's plan, right? Send a small task force and just kill David, right? And then bring everyone back home, and it makes you look good if you spare everyone else, right? You only kill the bad king and you spare everyone else. That'll make you look really good, right? Sounds like it's a pretty sound plan, right? But then, Absalom, being not the brightest youngster, I guess you could say, he decides to go like, oh, let's get Hushai. Of course, to be fair, Absalom doesn't know that Hushai is a saboteur, right? So now here's the saboteur's plan. You probably don't want to send a small task force because if a ninja fights a samurai, he's probably gonna lose. So why don't we just send everybody and then go kill David? Why don't we just send the whole army and fight him? That sounds like a better plan, right? I think that's a good way of doing things, right? Which obviously is not a good plan, right? You don't want to just send everybody to go hunt for one guy. I mean, if anyone would have a brain cell would know that David is really good at these cat and mouse games, and you don't want to send an army doing that. I mean, how do you think Saul died, right? How do you think Saul died at the end of 1 Samuel, right? So, like, you would think that this is terrible advice, right? And so, I don't know why Absalom thought this was good advice to follow, because, I mean, if anyone knew what happened earlier in the book of Samuel, you would know that this is terrible. This is a terrible idea, right? The small task force would have been a lot better. But Absalom goes like, you know what? Let's have a war. Let's fight, right? Who doesn't want a good fight? And so Absalom takes Hushai's advice. Of course, then, Hushai does the whole saboteur thing. Tells Abiathar and... Sorry, not Abiathar. He does Abiathar and who? And Zadok. So, like, two of David's other, like, leaders in his army, I guess you could say. Well, Abiathar's the priest, right? And they tell him this plan. And they're like, alright, we're going to set up an ambush on Absalom's army to guarantee our chances of winning, right? So, they go do that. And basically, the idea here is that David will have the upper hand, right? Because Absalom's been fed a pretty bad plan, and it allows for David and all his guys to set up an ambush, right, to defeat Absalom's army. And so that's what ends up happening, and then we get this little bit where it goes from 0 to 100 real fast, where like Ahithophel is so bitter about not having his words followed and he just hangs himself. Like, are you for real, my guy? I mean, I get that. I guess if you see it from Ahithophel's perspective, right? He's like, the idea is that, like, are you serious? You just threw out like dishwater. I mean, I was how you got the throne, buddy, right? And now you're gonna disregard my pretty good advice. So I guess that's probably the reasoning Ahithophel had to hang himself after, you know, Absalom rejects his, like, words of wisdom once. But I still think it's like a 0 to 100 thing. I don't think hanging yourself is the best way of going about it. But Ahithophel's dead, so I suppose it works out better for David because, you know, by Ahithophel killing himself, Absalom basically loses his best guy, right? Because Ahithophel is relatively a smart guy, right? I mean, sure, the whole concubine thing was not a good plan, but the other thing was a good plan. So we'll give him points where he deserves it. But he's dead now, so I guess it doesn't matter, huh? Those brownie points go into waste, I guess. I don't know why I put a T there. Wrong guess. Then we get this last part in chapter 17 where basically David and his guys are preparing to fight. And the interesting thing is the Bible points out that David has a lot of allies. And ironically, allies that you would not think would be his allies, right? All these guys from, like, he's got people from the Ammonites, he's got, like, from Gilead, you know, people that David has, like, beaten the snot out of earlier. You know, like, David has allies in these places. And so not only does David have the advantage of the element of surprise, because David is now making a plan against Absalom's army that's going to show up now, but he also has the added element of surprise by having all these extra guys through these allies. And so, with that being said, you know, this kind of, you know, once I've explained the point by point of, like, Absalom is taking on bad advice, David knows that Absalom's coming, and David has all these allies. You can kind of see where this is going to go, right? You kind of see where this is going to go. Not well for Absalom. Which is what we're going to read about in chapter 18. Now David mustered the men who were with him, and appointed over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. So David sent out his troops, a third under the command of Joab, a third under Joab's brother Abishai, son of Zeruiah, and a third under Ittai the Gittite. The king told the troops, I myself will surely march out with you. But the men said, You must not go out. If we are forced to flee, they won't care about us. Even if half of us die, they wouldn't care. But you are worth 10,000 of us. It would be better for you to give us support from the city. And the king answered, I will do whatever seems best to you. So the king stood beside the gate, while all his men marched out in units of hundreds and of thousands. And the king commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, Be gentle with the young man Absalom, for my sake. And all the people heard the king giving orders concerning Absalom to each of the commanders. Now David's army marched out of the city to fight Israel, and the battle took place in the forests of Ephraim. There Israel's troops were routed by David's men, and the casualties that day were great. 20,000 men. The battle spread out over the whole countryside, and the forest swallowed up more men that day than the sword. Now Absalom happened to meet David's men. He was riding his mule, and as the mule went under the thick branches of a large oak, Absalom's hair got caught in the tree. He was left hanging in midair, while the mule he was riding kept going. Then one of the men saw what had happened. When one of the men saw what had happened, he told Joab, "I saw Absalom hanging in an oak tree." So Joab said to the man who had told him this, "What? You saw him?" Sorry, that's not the voice I gave Joab. "What? You saw him? Why didn't you strike him to the ground right there? Then I would have given you 10 shekels of silver and a warrior's belt." But the man replied, "Even with 1,000 shekels were weighed out into my hands, I would not lay a hand on the king's son. In our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, protect the young man Absalom for my sake. And if I had put my life in jeopardy, and nothing is hidden from the king, you would have kept your distance from me." So Joab said, "I will not wait like this for you." So he took 3 javelins in his hand and plunged them into Absalom's heart. Nothing like overkill, while Absalom was still alive in the oak tree. And 10 of Joab's armor-bearers surrounded Absalom, struck him, and killed him. Nothing like double overkill. Then Joab sounded the trumpet, and the troops stopped pursuing Israel, for Joab halted them. They took Absalom, threw him into a big pit in the forest, and piled up a large heap of rocks over him. Meanwhile, all the Israelites fled to their homes. Now, during his lifetime, Absalom had taken a pillar and erected it in the king's valley as a monument to himself, for he thought... Sorry, who's talking here? Absalom taking a pillar and erected it in the king's valley. Okay, so this is Absalom thinking. So I need to do his voice one last time. "I have no son to carry on the memory of my name. He made the pillar after himself, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day." I gotta backtrack. I think Absalom does have a son. I know he has a daughter, but I don't know if he has a son as well. I'll check that later. Verse 19. Now Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, said, let me run, and take the news to the king, for the Lord has vindicated him by delivering him from the hand of our enemies." You are not the one to take the news today," Joab told him. "You may take the news another time, but you must not do so today, because the king's son is dead." Then Joab said to a Cushite, "Go, tell the king what you have seen." The Cushite bowed down before Joab and ran off. Now Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, again said to Joab, Come what may, please let me run behind the Cushite." But Joab replied, "My son, why do you want to go? You don't have any news that would bring you a reward." And he said, "Come what may, I want to run." So Joab said, "Run then." Then Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and outran the Cushite. Now while David was sitting between the inner and outer gates, the watchman went up to the roof of the gateway by the wall. And as he looked out, he saw a man running alone. The watchman called out to the king and reported it. The king said, "If he is alone, he must have good news." And the runner came closer and closer. Then the watchman saw another runner, and he called down to the gatekeeper, "Look, another man is running alone." And the king said, "He must be bringing good news too." The watchman said, "It seems to me that the first one runs like Ahimaaz, son of Zadok." "He is a good man," the king said. "He comes with great news." Then Amahaz called out to the king, "All is well." He bowed down before the king with his face to the ground and said, "Praise be to the Lord your God, for he has delivered up those who lifted their hands against my lord the king." The king asked, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" Amahaz answered, "I saw great confusion, just as Joab was about to send the king's servant and me, but I don't know what it was." And the king said, "Stand aside and wait here." So he stepped aside and stood there. Then the Cushite arrived and said, "My lord the king, hear the good news. The Lord has vindicated you today by delivering you from the hand of all who rose up against you." And the king asked the Cushite, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" Excuse me. The Cushite replied, "May the enemies of my lord the king, and all who rise up to harm you, will be like that young man." Which is a euphemism for, nah, he's deader than dead. The king was shaken. He went up to the room over the gateway, and he wept. As he went, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." So, yeah, Absalom is dead. And that's the end of his arc. Only 7 chapters, but he was a pretty interesting character in that, right? You know, he started out on the right track, but he got arrogant, and when that arrogance quickly overcame him, right? And that following that arrogance comes foolishness, right? Not taking decent advice from Ahithophel and taking the bad advice from Hushai. And then, of course, Absalom is killed in a pretty terrible way, right? Just lots of overkill. Just full of oops, I guess. And so that's the end of him, right? And now the story goes back to focusing on David. So let's go this bit by bit, right? So chapter 18 starts, and David gives the order, an odd order, to his generals, right? So that would be Abishai, Joab, and Ittai, right? And he tells them, like, okay, beat up whoever you have to beat up, kill whoever you have to kill, but, you know, try and spare Absalom for my sake, right? You know, like, he's still my son. And, you know, it's interesting that David thinks this, right? That David would think of sparing the guy, even though, like, Absalom's been pretty awful to his dad, right? Like, you gotta think about, like, not just the whole usurping the throne thing, right? Which I guess is a pretty big deal. But, you know, Absalom's done other things to kind of, like, you know, to offend his father, if you will, right? The other big one being, like, just killing Amnon, right? And, you know, being deceitful to his dad and all that, right? Like, Absalom's been he's done a lot of terrible things to his dad, and it's interesting to think that, like, you know, David still wants him to be spared. David still wants him to live. And this is what makes this something to consider here, right? Especially you younger guys on here, right? Something to really consider. Despite the fact that we complain and talk mad shit about, like, the older generation and how they failed us, how the older generation, you know, does so many wrong things, and we have to live with the consequences of that, right? Think about how, like, the older generation is so self-absorbed, and they do a lot of things for their interests and really didn't consider long-term ramifications and how it would affect us and even poison us. Sure, all that is true. But at the same time, there's still the older generation still had our interests at heart. And it's one of those things that you have to take the good and bad of it, where there's also how we kind of ended up where we are now, right, as a society. Because even when, right, us younger people, we've kind of squandered, and now we openly rebel and do all this other idiotic stuff and even self-destructive, right? The older generation stands by and, doesn't just get the belt and hit you with it, because, they do care, just like how David cared for Absalom. And of course, there's good and bad in it, right? Like, you think of David's judgment here. I wouldn't think that it's the best judgment, right? To want to spare Absalom. Which is interesting that we see Joab's perspective, right? Where Joab, being the more practical person, he thinks like, now we should just waste them, right? We should just waste Absalom when we have the chance, right? And of course, the funny thing that the Bible tells us is that, like, God allows nature to kind of just, put David's enemies on like a silver platter, right? Nature does the work for them, right? As, the scripture says that, like, well, the forest killed more people than the sword did, right? And so, and then Absalom gets like his fabulous hair caught in a tree, right? That's kind of awkward, and of course there's a symbolism in that too, right? The vanity of man is often what will kill them, right? And so with Absalom, there was that whole thing where, like, he was doing the whole Justin Bieber thing where, like, he could sell his hair for like a lot of money because people loved him that much, right? But of course, it's that vanity that ends up getting him killed, right? And so that's the poetic irony here, where Absalom's hair gets caught in a tree, and of course his hair is so fabulous it doesn't just break, right? So his fabulous hair gets caught in the tree, and he's stuck hanging there. And surprisingly, he doesn't just die from hanging, but he hangs there for a while, and then Joab just like stabs him a bunch of times, and then everybody just like takes extra stabs at him. It's almost like the Ides of March all over again. Well, I guess this would be before the Ides of March, so sorry, Roman Senate, but Jewish soldiers did it first. But oh, that was a terrible joke. But I think about, like, when David wanted to spare Absalom, it's just like not the best idea, but at the same time it shows that, like, David had that compassion for him. And I reflect on, like, how things are now, and how, like, the older generation is just taking it as, like, we, the younger generation, just like do everything to, like, basically spit on their, all their good things too. We just spit on them basically. But the older generation, all they care about is that we keep living, right? And that's kind of what I see when I read this passage with, like, David and his desire for Absalom to live. But of course, the contrast is Joab's like, nah, that's a bad idea, right? I'm gonna just take justice in my own hands. And of course, Joab is a problematic character in that sense, right? Like, I don't think that is. I mean, it's one of those things that makes things like war so ugly, right? Like, neither route is particularly good, right? The idea of, like, well, I'm just gonna take justice in my own hands from Joab, and of course David wanting to spare his son, a dangerous enemy, right? Both of them are ugly in their own ways, right? And both of them have their own problems. But of course, the story, as we are told here, Joab is the one who gets his option, and he goes against David's orders for the sake of practicality and kills Absalom, right? And then there's this funny little scene where, like, there's this soldier that just, like, refuses to, he's like, oh, I found Absalom. And it's like, oh, why didn't you kill him? And it's like, but weren't we told to keep him alive? like, we're gonna take him prisoner now, right? And Joab's like, nah, man, we're gonna waste him. And I love how the Bible just like describes basically like mega overkill, right? So first Joab thinks not one, not two, but 3 javelins, and then like stabs him 3 times, right? Like, one good spear stab should be enough, right? I mean, Absalom is a non-moving target, right? He's a free kill, right? And you feel the need to use 3 javelins on him, like that's a bit much, right? Then once his body falls from the tree, a bunch of other soldiers, stab him a whole bunch of times, right? Like he wasn't already dead. You just gotta overkill him all the more, right? I just find that kind of comical, a comical end for Absalom, right? And then we get the last part of the story where basically it goes back to David, and he's waiting in where is he anyways? Where is David? David is it told us in the last chapter. Let me just read that up again. So David is hanging out in, I think he's hanging out in Gilead or something like that. So David's hanging out in one of their cities, and he's like hanging out the kind of the outer part of the city, so he could hear the news. Oh, excuse me, of what was happening with the fight, right? And then of course, Joab sends. Well, he originally was just gonna send one messenger, and what's interesting here is that Joab is pretty adamant. Let's just send the one messenger, right? And it's interesting because why he does this, and I speculate that wow, he really knows David, right? Because when David sees the one messenger, he's like, there's one messenger and he's alone. It means the news must be good, right? And the assumption behind this of why the gatekeepers would think that one messenger is a good thing is because the assumption is everyone else is staying behind and partying, right? And only one messenger is sent. That is probably the reasoning why when David says, oh, there's a guy traveling alone, that must mean there's good news, right? So it's an interesting thing because when Joab had his original intention of sending one guy to send David the message, it really shows that he knows David, right? He knows him pretty well. But of course, David quickly finds out that is not true, as the Cushite does give him that weird euphemism of he's deader than dead, right? And David becomes really sad about it, right? That his son is dead. Despite the fact that this same son, wanted to kill you 5 minutes ago. But David was still really, really broken up about it because, of course, David loved his son despite all his shortcomings. And so David cries about it, and that is how chapter 18 ends. Of course, the thing to observe here is how much David loved Absalom. And, as I brought up earlier, this idea of the older generation, what they really care about is that the young generation keeps living and that they continue, that they would succeed then, right? At least in a proper manner, not like how Absalom usurped them. But, David even makes this statement about how he wished it was him instead, right? It's like, oh, if only I was the one who died instead of you, right? Even though the whole idea of this fight was that no, David must live, right? But here's David kind of wishing well, better if I had died than you did, right? And so it's very interesting to observe that. It's very it can seem contradictory here
right, of, the agenda of the story, that, well, we're telling a story of David, but yet David kind of wishes that, like, no, his story would have ended and that Absalom would have kept living. But the thing to keep in mind here is that, David was told by the prophet Nathan that God had other plans, right? That God had a plan for David's life and that it wasn't so easy to get out of it, despite David's shortcomings, right? And God had a plan, and so David has to live and see it through, right? But here David is, lamenting that he wishes it was him who had died instead of Absalom. Of course, David needs to get snapped out of this, and that's what's going to happen in chapter 19. So we're going to finish off with chapter 19. I know it's going to be a short stream today, but most Bible reading ones are. Partly because I'm also really tired, and I also have to work on something else as well. So we're going to just finish with chapter 19, and then that will be the end of the stream. So chapter 19. Joab was told, "The king is weeping and mourning for Absalom." And for the whole army, the victory that day was turned into mourning, because on that day the troops heard it said, "The king is grieving for his son." The men stole into the city that day, as men steal in who are ashamed when they flee from battle. The king covered his face and cried aloud, "Oh, my son Absalom! Oh, Absalom, my son!" Then Joab went into the house of the king and said, "Today you have humiliated your men, who have just saved your life, and the lives of your sons and daughters, and the lives of your wives and your concubines. You love those who hate you, and you hate those who love you. You have made it clear today that the commanders and their men mean nothing to you. I see that you would be pleased if Absalom were alive today and all of us were dead. Now go out and encourage your men. I swear by the Lord that if you do not go out, not a man will be left with you by nightfall. This will be worse for you than all the calamities that have come to you from your youth until now." So the king got up and took his seat in the gateway. And when the men were told, "The king is sitting in the gateway," they all came before him. Meanwhile, the Israelites had fled to their homes. Now throughout the tribes of Israel, all the people were arguing to themselves, saying, "The king delivered us from the hand of our enemies. He's the one who rescued us from the hand of the Philistines. But now he has fled to the country to escape from Absalom. And Absalom, whom we anointed to rule over us, has died in battle. So why do you say nothing about bringing the king back?" King David sent this message to Zadok and Abiathar the priest. "Ask the elders of Judah, why should you be the last to bring the king back to his palace? Since what is being said throughout Israel has reached the king at his quarters. You are my relatives, my own flesh and blood. So why should you be the last to bring back the king? And say to Amasa, are you not my own flesh and blood? May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you are not the commander of my army for life in place of Joab." Now he had won over the hearts of the men of Judah, so that they were all of one mind. They sent word to the king, "Return, you and all your men." Then the king returned and went so far as Jordan. Now the men of Judah had come to Gilgal to go out and meet the king and bring him across the Jordan. Shimei, son of Gera, the Benjamite from Bahurim, hurried down with the men of Judah to meet King David. Now with him were 1,000 Benjamites along with Ziba, the steward of Saul's house, and his 15 sons and 20 servants. They rushed to the Jordan where the king was,
and they crossed at the ford to take the king's household over and to do whatever he wished. When Shimei, son of Gera, crossed the Jordan, he fell prostrate before the king and said to him, "May my lord not hold me guilty. Do not remember how your servant did wrong on the day my lord the king left Jerusalem. May the king put it out of his mind. For I, your servant, know that I have sinned. But today I have come here as the first from the tribes of Joseph to come down and meet my lord the king." Then Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, said, "Shouldn't Shimei be put to death for this? He has cursed the Lord's anointed." And David replied, "And what does this have to do with you, you son of Zeruiah? What right do you have to interfere? Should anyone be put to death in Israel today? Don't I know that today I am the king of Israel?" So the king said to Shimei, "You shall not die." And the king promised him an oath. Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson, also went down to meet the king. He had not taken care of his feet, or trimmed his mustache, or washed his clothes from the day the king left until the day he safely returned. When he came from Jerusalem to meet the king asked him, "Why didn't you go with me, Mephibosheth?" He replied, "My lord the king, since I, your servant, am lame, I said, I will have my donkey saddled, and I will ride on it, so I can go with the king. But Ziba, my servant betrayed me." Oh, he's still talking. "And he has slandered your servant to my lord the king. And my lord the king is like an angel of God. So do whatever you wish. All my grandfather's descendants deserve nothing but death from my lord the king, but gave your servant a place among those who eat at your table. So what right do I have to take any more appeals to the king?" So the king said to him, "Why say more? I order you and Ziba to divide the land." Mephibosheth said to the king, "Let him take everything, now that my lord the king has returned home safely." Now Barzillai the Gileadite also came down from Rogelim to cross the Jordan with the king, and to send him on his way from there. Now Barzillai was very old, 80 years of age. He provided for the king during his stay in Mahanaim, for he was a very wealthy man. And the king said to Barzillai, "Cross over with me and stay with me in Jerusalem, and I will provide for you." But Barzillai answered the king, "How many more years will I live, that I should go up to Jerusalem with the king? I am now 80 years old. Can I tell the difference between what is enjoyable and what is not? Can your servant taste what he eats and what he drinks? Can I still hear the voices of male and female singers? Why should your servant be an added burden to my lord the king? Your servant will cross over the Jordan with the king for a short distance. But why should the king reward me in this way? Let your servant return, that I may die in my own town, near the tomb of my father and mother. But here is your servant Kimham. Let him cross over with my lord the king. Do for him whatever you wish." And the king said, "Kimham shall cross over with me, and I will do for him whatever you wish, and anything you desire from me I will do for you." So all the people crossed the Jordan, and the king crossed over. So all the people crossed the Jordan, and the king crossed over. And the king kissed Barzillai and bid him farewell. And Barzillai returned to his home. When the king crossed over to Gilgal, Kimham crossed with him, and all the troops of Judah and half the troops of Israel had taken the king over. Soon all the men of Israel were coming to the king and saying to him, "Why did our brothers, the men of Judah, steal the king away and bring him and his household across the Jordan, together with all his men?" All the men of Judah answered the men of Israel, "We did this because the king is closely related to us. Why are you angry about it? Have we eaten any of the king's provisions? Have we taken anything for ourselves?" Then the men of Israel answered the men of Judah, "We have 10 shares in the king, so we have a greater claim on David than you have. Why then do you treat us with contempt? Weren't we the first to speak of bringing back our king?" But the men of Judah pressed their claims even more forcefully than the men of Israel. And to leave on that ominous note, I think it's a great way to end the reading session. Because even though David is returning to his throne, there clearly appears to be some turmoil between the men. Just to do a bit of a real talk here, and kind of just summing up, this story arc, right? So as I've said many a times in these streams, the central theme of the book of Samuel is that only God can be king, right? And so we've seen many a king come and many a king go, and how arrogance and pride can destroy not just one man, but can destroy many, right? And so, when we first saw with Saul, he became prideful and arrogant, and that led to not just his own destruction, but to the destruction of many, right? And of course, David and his arrogance, he has left many people, he has left a mountain of corpses, under his wake. And, we see many people call him out on this, right? And Shumai being one of them, or Shimei being one of them, right? He just like calls him out on the fact that David has caused so much death and destruction. And then of course we have Absalom, right? And Absalom, not only did his arrogance lead to his own death, but to the death of many Israelites. And so it's easy to see how like people in power, when they allow arrogance and pride to consume them, it leads to the death of many under them as well, right? And this is true across the board. It's not just a Bible story. It's a fact of life, right? And so, you think of any regime in the past, all the communist regimes and stuff like that, right? It just takes, if one evil person can control the crowd like that, you can lead to so many deaths, right? On both sides. And so that has happened many a times, and that's still happens to this day. And of course, while we read through stories like in the Bible or read through history, it's always like these chief figureheads that lead to that destruction. It's not that straightforward, right? After all, it's not like Hitler alone just managed to kill all those Jews, right? But it took a lot of normal people in Germany to accept his lies, right? And so it comes down to the common people as well. And that's what we kind of see at the end here, right? Now we have this animosity between Israel and Judah. This animosity will obviously spring up to more death and destruction, but obviously there is influence from the higher ups, from like the kings, right? Like David and Absalom, and their influence over the people. But of course, the people themselves, you're not immune to corruption and pride, overtaking you, right? No one is immune to that. anyone would be foolish to think that they are. But you know, David's life is not, the craziness hasn't ended yet, because you know, as the king, he's going to be the prime target, if you will, of a lot of scorn and a lot of pain, right? But we'll see how he gets out of it. Now, an interesting thing about when as we read through Second Samuel, you notice that like the presence of God is not as prominent as we see like in, like, for example, First Samuel, right? Like I mean, I guess is what happens when like the prophets aren't around, right? And this is one of the things that's like, you know, when you read through the Old Testament and the role of the prophet, right? You kind of see a more direct interaction between God and people through the prophets. Once again, that's how you should define a prophet, right? Is that prophets are people who have this direct contact with God, kind of thing, right? Because we hear, you know, that's one of the things. The other interesting thing I want to point out as we read through these chapters and the Absalom Arc is that, of course, so much destruction and death happens when, like, once again, when, as my thesis statement and the theme of, you know, the book of Samuel is only God can be king. Well, when God is kind of divorced from the story, as we see here, yeah, it leads to bad things, right? When God is not the one leading the people, when God is not the one in charge of their lives as well as our own lives, right? You see that bad things happen, right? And that's kind of what we've been reading with the Absalom story. The bad things happen, and it's easy to see that, like, well, that's what happens when we are so divorced from God, right? Just as the story kind of has this lack of God in the story, right? And that's an interesting thing about this arc as well, the Absalom arc, as I like to call it, is that, like, well, God is also kind of not around very much, right? He's not leading the people directly, right? And without that, you know, people are just kind of going on their own devices and just mayhem, right? And I mean, that's the nature of human beings, is that we live for mayhem, right? So that's all I really have to say about that, these chapters. I mean, there could be a lot more I could always bring back to about Absalom and him being an interesting character, but I think I did a lot more. I did enough of that in the last video. And of course, like, here we kind of just see him, like, accept his downfall, right? Because he becomes so arrogant, and then, like, he acts foolishly, and, you know, another hot take. Well, I mean, it's still the same hot take, right? Like, that's kind of when I read about, like, how Absalom just kind of acts foolishly because he's so arrogant. I'm like, yeah, that's my generation in a nutshell, right? You know, people just acting really foolishly, and, you know, it was funny. I was having a talk with some of my buddies because in one of the Discord servers I'm in, we're just talking about, like, not this channel obviously, but another channel that I'm hugely involved with, which kind of discloses what I'm talking about and whom I'm talking about. But, you know, one of the problems we've run across in that channel is that, like, we have a lot of people who don't filter what they say, and it can be a problem, especially when it's on stream, right? Not just, like, let me put that better, right? Like, when I say filter, I mean, like, okay, obviously I bring up some hot takes on this, right? But it's more like I use the hot takes as, like, an extreme illustration of the point I'm getting across. But that's not what I mean when I say, like, people just say unfiltered things. But, like, you know, people just saying, like, being really crass, not just in their language, but, like, just being really insensitive, just, you know, and people just antagonizing each other on stream. Like, it's embarrassing to watch sometimes. And the big problem is, like, I mean, part of it is that, like, okay, you're dealing with young people and like, young adults and teenagers. So when you have a bunch of young adult teenage guys, everything's like a dick measuring contest. But, like, at the same time, it's like one of the big problems we've run into here is that, like, oh, you know, everyone's like, because so many guys have, like, things to prove, you know, the whole dick measuring thing. They're extremely insensitive, right? And it's like, guys, like you can't just go around saying stuff like that and being insensitive to people, right? And so where does that, well, okay, well, why am I telling this story, right? It's kind of what I'm getting at here is that, like, you know, that arrogance of just like everything is about you, which is essentially what dick, when guys do their dick measuring contests, it's basically what it comes down to, right? It's about like everything's about you, how great you are, whatever, right? And guys trying to show off and whatever. And sure, there's a little time and place for guys to show off, right? But there's a healthy amount of it, and then there's just constantly doing it, right? And putting other people down as you do it, right? It's a little different. I mean, the lines are blurred at times, but you know, the idea is that like you've got to be wise about things. That was kind of what we were talking about when I was having this like meeting with some friends, and it's like we got to be wise, right, about when we should say stuff and how we should approach certain subject matter and whatever. Right? You got to be wise about it. You got to, you know, be sensitive about, you know, your audience member and everything. You got to be sensitive and discerning is the Christian word we use for it, right? To know when to speak and how to say it and all that, right? And of course, like the one of my major critiques is that like, well, my generation, it's partly my generation's fault too, because you see 30-year-olds do this too, which is embarrassing to watch at times, right? You know, when you watch, when I watch like, you know, 18-year-olds do this, it's kind of like I'm more forgiving because like, okay, you're 18, you don't know anything, so you will learn the hard way, right? But that's part of growing up. That's life experience, right? You learn the hard way that you can't just do whatever you want. You can't just be foolish all the time, right? You'll wisen up is the, you know, how people would say it, right? You would wisen up as you know, make mistakes in life or whatever. But when you're like my age and you're still acting like that, like people aren't going to be so thrilled about you, right? They're going to be like, seriously, like what the hell's wrong with you? And rightfully so. You should think of that if like a 30-year-old still acts like immaturely like that. And what's this got to do with the Absalom story? Well, that's basically, you know, my generation has walked into that problem that Absalom did that led to his downfall, right, and his death ultimately, right. And it, you know, I was making the whole joke with like the battle strategy meeting, right? Instead of like taking Ahithophel's pretty sound advice, you know, Absalom just like, nah, man, I'm just gonna do whatever, right? And Absalom acts very foolishly in that regard. That he doesn't actually consider the wiser option, which was actually Ahithophel's, you know, advice, contrary to the fact that Ahithophel's the bad guy in this. Well, he's a bad guy in the story, right? But he's the one with the sound advice. But but Absalom acts so foolishly, and you know, when I think about when Absalom acts so foolishly, to act upon like Ahithophel's bad advice, but then to not act on his good advice, um, you know, and Absalom being so foolish, I see that real danger in like young people, right? And that's why I try to foster, you know, like I want to be able to help. That's why this channel exists in a lot of ways, right? It's like I try to help you, and I like to think, you know, of course I'm not going to try to be arrogant about it because, you know, I too am a person who's learning, but at the same time, you know, especially to your younger guys, maybe some of you older guys might view me as not being adequate to give you life experience advice, but you know, to help some of you guys as you guys are, you know, acquiring life experience, and I want to be someone who can help you with that, and not, you know, to prevent stuff like what happens with Absalom, right? Because, you know, Absalom's death scenario is pretty extreme, right? And the overkill is kind of designed to show you it's extreme. But you know, we all of us are in danger of that, right? Of getting caught like Absalom does. And you know, there's the irony of, you know, his fabulous hair, as I've joked about already. You know, his hair gets caught in the tree, right? And so it's his vanity that gets him caught, and what gets him killed, right? And that's so true, especially today, right? And of course, one of the big problems in our modern era is that, like, you know, because of things like the internet and, you know, using, you can hide yourself behind a screen, right? your vanity, you can protect your vanity, if that makes sense. When you hide yourself behind a screen and then you just talk mad shit to people and whatever, right? But you know, that's only gonna get you so far, right? Because eventually that same vanity that you work so hard to protect, it still will come to bite you, right? I mean, that's all the more reason we need to be humble, right? And to strive to be better people than we are now, right? Every day. And so that is one of the calls that God is, you know, let people. That's what the Bible means when it talks about like sanctification, right? That, you know, because God has Jesus has forgiven us of all our sin, then you are empowered to make yourself a better person, right? To become a better person is possible. Let's put it that way, right? That's kind of how the Christian worldview views that, right? Is that like, because we're forgiven, you don't have to dwell on the fact that we're sinners, right? You can dwell that you are forgiven, and then on that, you can make yourself a better person instead of being dragged back by the past, right? But one of the things that's interesting to observe here when we read through the Absalom story, the dangers of that vanity, right? And Absalom is a very like, and that's another thing that actually makes him an interesting character to read. And I encourage you guys to read through those chapters again, not just the ones we read this week, but the ones we read last week. Is that like the beauty of his story and studying Absalom is that like you get straight to the point of like seeing how vanity overtakes him and leads to his downfall, right? And you actually get to see it by step by step, which is one of the things that kind of I felt like, from a literary perspective, when you read like Saul and David, right? Like the Bible kind of jumps around a little bit with their, how pride kind of leads to their downfalls. David not as badly as like Saul and Absalom, obviously, but how pride can lead to one's downfall. With Saul and David, the Bible jumps around a little bit, so you can kind of get lost and not easily see it. Whereas with Absalom, you just read these 7 chapters and you see it so clearly. The Bible goes step by step, and that's another reason why I think Absalom is so great to study. And with that said, I think that's also why, like, when I read these chapters and then reflect it within not just my own life, but within the life of my generation, right? You can see the step by step with Absalom, just like how, I've lived for like 30 some odd years and see the step by step of people my age group and how they develop, into the kind of people Absalom is, right? These self-righteous, major pricks, right? Basically. But I think if we are able to study, the Bible like this and actually honestly analyze ourselves, then that will lead to like, humility and repentance, and that will empower us to be better people, right? That's what we should strive for, right? To be better people. And how else will you do it than to be honest about like how we should change, right? And not allow ourselves to be poisoned by pride, right? So anyway, that's all I have to say about that. Boy, how I am tired. I'm gonna end the stream, but before that, we're just do a bit of housekeeping. So don't forget to check out yesterday's Throwback Thursday episode. I know technically it's not Thursday anymore, but they're Throwback Thursdays because I upload them on Thursdays. So it definitely counts. But you should definitely check my Heroes of Might Magic 2 Price of Loyalty playthrough right now for Throwback Thursday, which I will also have this coming week, as next Thursday I will have one uploaded. As far as Monday and Wednesday streams are concerned, we'll see what I end up doing. As you know, that this week I had finished Mario and Rabbids, the Kingdom Battle. I may come back to them to kind of play some extra content, like the just post-game stuff. We'll see if I actually play a lot of that. Or I just play it myself, or I'm probably going to replay the game myself just to, like, play it again in the future. Just like I've started replaying Bravely Default 2 yesterday. So that was kind of nice, right? Just to replay it myself. Because sometimes, you know, once you've played a game on stream and I've had you guys watch my first reactions, I just want to replay those games myself. And that's another reason why, like, I'm tired all the time. It's like, I want to find time to play games. But then, of course, like, at my age, it's kind of hard to do that, right? But with that being said, though, we'll see what we end up doing on Monday and Wednesday, assuming I stream both those days. But basically, the next little while is going to be pretty relaxed. I have a plan for September. I'm not sure I'm going to go through with it yet. I'll let you know what it is when we get closer to September. It's weird to think we're already, like, almost halfway through August. So probably in 2 weeks, I'll let you know what's up with that. What's going to be going on in September. In 2 weeks, I'll let you know. But until then, you know, the next 2 weeks of streams will probably just be like, you know, I might play like some Pokemon Unite or something, or Tetris 99, or just, you know, screw around in something, right? So we'll see what they are. No definite plans on that yet. Next Thursday, we'll have our Throwback Thursday episode of Price of Loyalty. And then, of course, next Friday, we will continue reading through 2nd Samuel. Of course, I should probably make a caveat now that since we are approaching the end of the book of Samuel, there are 2 ways we can go about this, right? Either we just continue reading in chronological order, and I will read through the book of Kings next, as it is a direct continuation of the book of Samuel. Or if you want, we can change to a New Testament book, right? We can do a book study on one of the New Testament books if you guys are down for that. Let me know what you guys are interested in, and we will adjust accordingly. That's all I have to do that's all I have to say for housekeeping. So this is going to be the end of the stream. If you guys enjoyed reading through the book of Samuel, and I encourage you guys to reread it yourselves. You know, study it. And of course, if you ever need help, you know, my Discord is in the link. And sorry, my Discord is in the description. And, you know, you can always just send me a message if you ever need help with things. And I'm always, I try to be available often on Discord to help if you want to understand things of the Bible better, or of Christianity better. You know, just give me a message, right? That's why I'm here. But I'm going to be logging off now. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Hope you guys have a great weekend. And I'll see you guys next time. So God bless you, and goodbye.